Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, Ms. Pincus. I'm now going to ask you some questions about healthcare at Brookhouse. You've provided to the inquiry a report which was compiled by Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group back in 2017. That's at VER 000106, if we could bring that up on screen. Thanks. So that, as we can see, that was provided as part of evidence for the Stephen Shaw inquiry in 2017, dated November 2017. Is that right, Ms. Pincus?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And I'd asked for that to be adduced in full, please, Chair. But Ms. Pincus, I'm not going to ask you in too much detail about this because we have the report and it provides the detail, and you've provided some more detail in your statement as well. But just to ask you about a few of the themes, it's right that this report focused on detained people at Brookhouse between the 15th of March and the 31st of October 2017, yes?
That's correct.
Okay. And one of the things that the report talks about and that you talk about in your statement is about the scale of vulnerabilities within the detained population at Brookhouse.
Yes.
And you note that of the 220 people seen by GDWG during that period, 105 were identified as vulnerable by your organisation in the sense, first of all, that's right in terms of the numbers, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, and the definition, I suppose, of vulnerability that you've used for this is someone who had a diagnosed mental illness, a serious physical health condition, or had expressed a wish of self-harm, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And did that sort of number, so that's 105 of 220, about half, did that sort of number accord with your own experience of the scale of the amount of people in Brookhouse who had vulnerabilities like that?
It did, yes.
And was that level, so like 1 in 2 people you see having that sort of vulnerability, was that pretty consistent across the years, or is that high or low or pretty consistent?
I would say it's consistent in the years since we've been working in Brookhouse.
Okay. The report also notes that you found from your own records that 17% of people that you saw had feelings of self-harm, which you note is likely to represent a significant underestimate. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I'm asked to ask you on behalf of G4S, on each occasion when a detainee or a detained person reported feelings of self-harm, would that trigger a safeguarding referral?
I think it would depend upon the degree to which it was expressed to us.
Okay. And so, again, is that just going back to whether you thought they were at risk of significant harm based on what they told you?
Yes.
You also, in your report, identified significant flaws in the role of the healthcare department at Brookhouse in identifying vulnerable people and in reporting clinical concerns to the Home Office.
Yes.
And for the record, that's dealt with from paragraph 97 of the statement onwards. And you explain, Ms. Pincus, that these failures related to failures to carry out effective screening, so that's right at the beginning of their detention, yes?
It's probably even before then. It's, oh yes, sorry, in relation to informing the Home Office.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And failures to correct omissions or mistakes in those initial screenings as well.
Omissions, yes.
Yeah,
so when further information came available, when, for example, health records arrived at the centre after the initial screening, there was no evidence that the Home Office had been updated.
And then, as you say, failure to share information with the Home Office. And you summarise in your statement 4 key areas of concern about that failure of information sharing. One is about evidence of vulnerability not being shared using the Rule 35 system. One is about confusion among medical staff about the role of Rule 35. One is about evidence of increasing vulnerability rarely being communicated by healthcare to the Home Office. And then there's also about practical difficulties restricting and detain people from accessing medical practitioners. If I can just ask you briefly about each of those. In terms of evidence of vulnerability not being shared using the Rule 35 system, presumably that links with the next one, which is about confusion about what Rule 35 was.
Yes, so there are, I think we've heard in previous evidence, there are three categories of Rule 35. One, if detention is injurious to health. One is if someone is suicidal, and one is if someone is a victim of torture. I believe that there were only Rule 35s relating to the third category, to the torture category, and this continues to this day.
And do you, from your experience, is the sort of failure to raise or to share information using the Rule 35 system about the other two bits, so the detention being injurious to health or feelings of suicide, is that due to lack of knowledge? Is that due to any instruction from the Home Office? Can you help us with why that happens?
I would not know.
Okay.
Whether it was poor training, but I don't know if you want me to.
Yeah, you can expand on
speculate.
Well, I mean, only if you have any experience of knowing why it hadn't happened on any particular occasions.
I don't have experience, but it's interesting that the category that has visual evidence is the only one that is reported.
That's the torture one you're talking
yes.
about? Yeah.
One wonders if people are reticent to make a claim based on a subjective perception of the other two, either due to not wanting to bring too many cases to the Home Office or due to their lack of training.
And one of the things you also say is that there was a failure of information sharing in relation to evidence of increasing vulnerability. You talked a bit earlier in a different context about this dynamic risk and dynamic vulnerability. Is that the same issue, that people's risk changed over time and you didn't see that communicated?
Absolutely, yes.
And then the final thing, which is relating to practical difficulties restricting detain people from accessing medical practitioners. In your experience, was that an issue of resources, or was that an issue of language, or is it a mixture of lots of different things?
It's really hard for me to be able to know the answer to that, but certainly when people presented at healthcare and requested appointments, they weren't available.
And one of the things that the inquiry has heard from a couple of sources is that when detained people were interviewed by various different agencies, there was a general feeling that almost the majority of concerns expressed were about healthcare-related issues. Are you able to tell us, was that your experience within GDWG?
It was definitely our experience, and I think it was also the experience of our visitors, as Jamie said yesterday.
I'd also asked Chair, although I'm not going to take Ms. Pincus to it, for the analysis of information sharing with the Home Office at VER 000104 to be adjusted in full as well. One of the things you do refer to specifically within your statement is that a lack of interpreters added to the difficulties of accessing healthcare. Do you have any insight, and I know you're not in there, but do you have any insight from your experience as to what impact this had on the disclosure of mental health issues?
I think it had the disclosure meant it had huge impact on every interaction that people had with healthcare. I think people reported to us that staff even used Google Translate, which is not a professional way of interpreting, especially for something as sensitive as medical care. So,
Jamie McPherson talked a bit yesterday about interpreters being an issue for visitors, and they couldn't always get access, and he gave an example of think a time where he had an hour with an Iranian detainee and they just had to use a dictionary to try and communicate a little bit. In terms of when you and other staff were seeing detained people in the visits hall, were language barriers a big issue?
I mean, I think our visitors would say it's miraculous how far you can get with no common language, with a lot of goodwill and time and intention and miming and a piece of paper and a pen. So I think visitors did remarkably well. But it would be wonderful to have the facility of interpreters.
And what about staff? So when you were going to see someone for a drop-in session, or your colleagues were, was it a similar? Were you at a similar level of barriers, or was it easier, harder?
Well, there were phones in the room, and we could use those to dial up the interpreters that our organisation used, so at our cost.
Okay.
But we would use interpreters that way.
So you used your own interpreters. I think we've heard, and I could be getting the name wrong, but I think it's Language Line was something that was used within Brookhouse. Were you able to use?
I think it's Language Line that we used.
That was what you used.
Yeah.
Okay. And to the best of your knowledge, you were having to use that at your own expense.
Yes, we would call up and give them our
Details.
Our code
and if somebody spoke no English and you knew that in advance, could you request an interpreter from G4S or the Home Office?
No.
Now, we've already talked a little bit about the culture of disbelief in the context of staff, DCOs, DCMs, etc., and the Home Office. But you also, in your statement, describe a culture of disbelief within healthcare staff at Brookhouse. Do you have any insight as to how that culture amongst healthcare staff came about?
I have no idea how that came about. I mean, it's not the culture that you encounter in the community when you go and see your GP. So...
You think, and so is your evidence that from what you were told, there was quite a stark difference in the extent to which healthcare staff at Brookhouse believed what they were being told compared to
exactly, yes,
anyone's experience outside?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You say in your statement at paragraph 123 that in the main, detained people were distrustful of healthcare staff, and you give your view that they did not play an objective role because they aligned themselves with the Home Office and with Brookhouse management. In what way did healthcare align themselves with the Home Office of Brookhouse management?
Well, I think they would express the view to detain people that they were feigning an illness in order to try and not be placed on a flight.
And were you told that that healthcare staff would actually say that to someone as opposed to writing it in the notes or something? Okay. And because of that, did detained people tell you that they didn't trust healthcare staff?
Yes, I mean, it's also a question of feeling dismissed when they presented with illnesses. So they'd be always endlessly told to come back later. They just didn't feel listened to.
And in your experience, again, trying to think back to 2017, did you perceive there to be a resource issue as well? Was it that there wasn't enough staff, healthcare staff, or do you not know?
I didn't know. From what we've heard in the inquiry, it seems likely that was.
One of the things you also say in your statement, this is at paragraph 130, is that the healthcare department at Brookhouse didn't encourage you to raise concerns and didn't reply when you did raise concerns. First of all, on the not encouraging, is that passively not encouraging or is that actively discouraging?
Well, if we had, if a detained person asked us to raise a matter with healthcare and signed a form to give us permission to do so, and when we called up healthcare and told them that we had the permission, they still refused to speak to us and said the detained person would have to come and raise the matter for themselves. And
was the reason, did they give sort of data protection reasons or
Yes,
something like that?
Confidentiality.
Okay. And you spoke a little earlier about staff at Brookhouse dissuading people from raising complaints. Did that just apply to staff DCOs, DCMs, etc., or did that apply to healthcare staff as well, in your knowledge?
I can't honestly remember whether any healthcare staff at that time told detained persons not to complain.
Okay. And was there a specific person or people within healthcare at Brookhouse that you were told to liaise with if you had a concern about someone's situation, or was it just the department as a whole?
I think it was the department as a whole.
And I've asked you, I suppose, about that type of thing in a couple of ways, about whether it was, just an inbox, or whether would having specific liaisons have been helpful to you?
I'm not sure, because I think after the given period we did have a specific liaison,
Okay.
and that was no more,
No more
successful.
Do you have one now?
No, we don't.
Okay.
But what we used to do at the time was to call up healthcare and say, a detained person's asked us to raise a concern. We have a form of authority. Will you talk to us about the detained person? And they'd say no for reasons of confidentiality. So then we'd say, okay, well, we're going to tell you some information. Please make sure that you record it and act accordingly. And then we'd pass on the information, even though we had no way of knowing how they were receiving it or what action they were taking.
Okay. And we've talked a little bit about, we've talked a while about complaints in the context of staff and physical mistreatment and verbal mistreatment. When it comes to complaints about healthcare, we've talked a little bit just there about complaining to healthcare about healthcare. In terms of sort of going higher than that, were you aware of, or were detained people aware of the ability to complain to the NHS directly, to NHS England, or was that not something that you were aware of?
That's something we weren't aware of, but we did, I think, at that time, James, I'm sure, did raise in his meetings with senior management and the Home Office, I'm sure he raised the issue of our difficulties with healthcare, okay. And someone from healthcare may even have been present at those meetings.
Thank you. One of the things on that note that you say is that you generally found healthcare to be dismissive of concerns and that action would rarely be taken, other than when you reported that a detained person was expressing thoughts of immediately committing suicide. In that specific example where someone expressed immediate thoughts about committing suicide, what action would be taken in those circumstances?
Well, all that would happen would we would be told that they would take immediate action.
Okay.
Whereas, as I said before, whenever we told them about an issue, we would ask them to report it, but they would not give us a verbal response to indicate the message was understood or action would be taken. In that case, there was a verbal response to indicate that action would be taken.
And where you told someone about that a detained person had thoughts of immediately or imminently committing suicide, were you ever aware of Rule 35 reports being completed in those situations?
I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. Do you think you would have been aware if they had been completed?
Only if the detained person was aware.
I want to move on to the next topic, which is about staffing levels at Brookhouse. Only relatively briefly, because we obviously have a fair amount of evidence about this issue. But you discuss in your statement being aware of delays within various parts of Brookhouse, so visits, healthcare, welfare, and frontline detention officers. And you say in your statement at paragraphs 176 and 179 to 181 that staff would actually expressly tell you that they felt overstretched and that understaffing made their roles much more difficult. If we can bring up on screen, please, ver 000249 at page 21. Chair, that's tab 11 of your bundle.
Thank you.
I should have actually noted where in the page it is. 1 second. I think you said to 30, I'm just going to get the exact bit of the page, that staff would talk to you about staffing levels often, and you said they're very, very understaffed. Is that right?
That was what they told me, yes.
And in what context would they tell you it? Was this sort of said almost as an excuse, or was it said just sort of off the cuff to vent frustration, or why would they be telling you?
So when I went into the centre, I'd try and build as big a rapport as I possibly could with the staff, just to make that part of the day pleasant. And sometimes if I was left waiting in a room as part of the entry process, they would kind of say, really sorry about this, but someone's just gone off on their break and there's no one to cover, so I can't take you, so you'll have to wait a while. That could be quite a long time. So that it would be, in that context, as an apology. Other times I'd ask people how they were, and they'd just start complaining because they had a lot to complain about. They had long shifts. The environment they were working in was not pleasant. I mean, in terms of the physicality of the building. And they would start complaining about short staffing, making their lives a nightmare. And then
I found it now, thankfully. At paragraph 296, it's on here at the bottom of the page. That's where you say the officers could talk to us about it. They're very, very understaffed. And obviously that can make staff quite fearful, and that doesn't help them to react calmly to situations. What did you mean by fearful? Do you remember?
I think staff it expressed to me that when they were on a wing, if there were very few officers on a wing, they felt kind of out of control. It made them feel out of control. I don't mean that they were acting out of control, but I mean they just felt they didn't have control of what was happening. I think they were aware that if any incident occurred, there was no backup. And people described to me how that made me feel. That's why I made that comment.
And we can bring that down, I think. But in your statement at paragraph 181, you say that one officer told me that if he became friendly with detained people, this made it emotionally difficult if he was later instructed to be part of a team going into the cell with shields and a full riot gear to restrain people. And we heard evidence about almost exactly this issue from Callum Tully, saying that he covered his face on one occasion, I think, when he had to see people. Was this just one officer that told you this?
It was just one officer.
And was this during the relevant period?
It was, yes.
And do you remember, was he sort of, again, the context of this, was this an explanation as to why they couldn't be friendly with detained people, or what was it?
He was explaining to me why he felt stressed in the job. And he was saying, it's not easy doing this job. You get to know people, and then they look at you as if, like, what are you doing when you're dressed up in gear going into their room to restrain them.
Okay. And just finishing on the topic of staffing levels, you say at paragraph 184 that GDWG suspected there might be a financial incentive to G4S to keeping staffing levels at a minimum in order to maximise profit. On what basis did you come to that view?
I just think we couldn't. There could be no other reason for it, because it wasn't an operationally sound practice. It didn't benefit their staff. It didn't benefit detained people. Therefore, one looks for what logical answer there could be, and one can only think it must be financial.
Okay. Next topic I want to ask you about is oversight by the IMB, the monitoring board. At paragraph 187 of your statement, that's page 66, you say that in your view, the IMB did not provide an adequate level of oversight and scrutiny during the relevant period, that they weren't sufficiently independent from Brookhouse management, that they weren't sufficiently critical of problems at Brookhouse, that they failed to deal with referrals from GDWG or foster a good relationship with you, and that they implicitly adopted Brookhouse managers' criticisms of your work. Is that fair as a summary?
It is, yes.
And do you have a view on why this developed at that time? Why this poor relationship, why this inadequate level of scrutiny developed at that time?
I think it built to this point over many years.
Okay.
And I can remember interactions with the IMB many years before, which were similar.
And where, to the best of your knowledge or your experience, was it the same people that stayed on the IMB for a while, and so it would build because the same person would sort of develop these views? Approach?
I believe so. And when you look at the disclosures to the inquiry, very often it's one named individual making extraordinary statements about GDWG. And I think it would be interesting for the IMB to analyse how much power one individual in the IMB has in relation to policy.
If we can bring up GDW 000007, please, and that's at tab 3 of your bundle, Chair. Ms. Pincus, this is a document which was disclosed by the GDWG, and it's a document which arises from an interview carried out with Jackie Colbran of the IMB in September 2015. And I understand it was carried out by a trustee of GDWG, is that right?
That's correct.
And it says stakeholder interview with the IMB. Just so that we're clear about this, your organisation would carry out interviews with different organisations and people you come into interaction with,
yes,
just to get sort of a flavour for what they were
work out
thinking.
for doing a good job, yeah.
Okay. And this was with Jackie Colbrane, who is listed as the chair of the IMB. Is that the one individual you were talking about earlier?
I think her name does appear many times in the disclosure, so yes.
And just reading from the top of here, in bold italics, it says, "This was a friendly meeting of people who all want to help detainees, but with a totally different view of the situation detainees are in. I think you could sum it up by saying they believe what G4S say, and we believe what detainees say. They believe we could be so much more effective if we were friends with G4S, i.e. if we were more like them. Although our approach is very different to theirs, I think we could fruitfully work together for the benefit of detainees." And I presume that was written by your trustee?
It was. I mean, this was an informal document that was just updating people internally as the result of a meeting.
And I appreciate it's not written by you, but looking at what it says, is that something that you would echo? Is that something that rings true with you?
It is, yes. I mean, I think it's important to say two things in terms of believing. A, believing doesn't mean that we exercise no discretion at what we're told. So we understand that sometimes people exaggerate, that sometimes their understanding of a situation varies over time, that on occasion people tell untruths. But we also believe that if you deny that the person in front of you is telling you that any form of truth, then you're denying the person. It's the most basic form of dehumanisation. If every person that presents to you is conditioning you if they're being friendly, or feigning an illness, which were the types of things that were said by, for example, healthcare and G4S, if the IMB started to echo those patterns of thought that meant that every interaction with a detainee was potentially an interaction with a new falsehood, then they were absolutely denying the person in front of them. That's like the most basic form of dehumanisation.
And this is in September 2015. In your experience, was this summary difference of your approach and the IMB's approach, was this something that still rang true in 2017?
Yes.
Relevant period. And how about today? Is it something that rings true today?
Today there's a different chair of the IMB and there are some new members. I had a meeting with the IMB in 2019 and I could see a clear divide between some of the people who've been in the organisation for a long time, some of the newer members. some people were definitely more keen to engage with us. And the current chair, who has been with the IMB for a number of years, has been meeting us regularly for us to exchange our impressions and experiences of what's happening in Brookhouse. And at the time of the period in question for the inquiry, if we raised a matter to the IMB, they would go first and foremost to management, to officers, to check out the situation, and they would take their view of the situation, which was usually that everything was fine. Today, I really believe that the IMB are currently also first going to speak to the detained person, which I think is as it should be.
And we can see on this document, which again is obviously from September 2015, towards the sort of first hole punch, which obviously you can't see on the screen, but it says, it's got some quotes, which is your understanding that those quotes are things that were said by Jackie Colbrand?
Yes.
Yeah. And one of the things it says is there's an element of suspicion about you. What do you take that to mean?
There is an element of suspicion about you. My understanding of that is that she was reflecting the views of G4S or the Home Office, because she's not saying, we are suspicious about you.
And to the best of your experience, was that suspicion still something that applied during the relevant period as well?
It is.
And then towards the bottom of the page, under what could we do better, it says, get a better relationship with senior management. You would be more effective if you had a positive relationship with Ben and Steve Skitt. I presume Ben there, to the best of your knowledge, is Ben Saunders, the former director of,
Yes.
Brookhouse. And do you think that approach of the IMB, thinking that you needed to be more positive with Ben Saunders and Steve Skitt, was that still something that applied during the relevant period?
I think it was.
And the suggestion, as noted at the bottom, they suggested that we should get the detainees to complain rather than complaining ourselves, and mentioned their IMB complaints box, but did say this wasn't emptied very often. Was that your approach, that you would try and facilitate a complaint from the detainee themselves first, and then only make the complaint yourselves if they were unwilling to do so?
Yes, because the whole basis of the charity is that we're trying to empower people, not trying to infantilise them by doing things on their behalf. So we'd do things on their behalf if they requested it or couldn't, but we'd always try to work with the person so they felt they had some agency.
And we've talked a little bit in the context of complaints about the lack of confidence that both you as an organisation and detained people had in the complaints process, where they felt, one person's word against another, or it wouldn't be substantiated. When it comes to complaints to the IMB, during the relevant period, did you have confidence in that complaints avenue?
We didn't, no.
And would you have advised detained people to complain to the IMB during that period?
We would have, but we would also have managed their expectations by explaining that the IMB had limited resources, so the day they put their complaint in, it wouldn't be the case that they'd meet an IMB member within the next day or so, because they were coming into the centre less frequently than that. And
now, do you have confidence in detained people making complaints to the IMB?
I would be more optimistic than I was then.
Sorry.
The document that you're referring to,
Yeah.
There's a couple of other extraordinary parts. And one is where the IMB said it would be better if no one was permitted to visit the same detainee for more than 3 months, which showed an extraordinary lack of insight into the detained person's experience.
And do you have any idea where they were coming from with that suggestion, like why they thought it would be better?
Well, they were saying you should be friendly but not friends. It would be better if no one was permitted to visit the same detainee for more than 3 months. It was almost as if we were like, I don't know, fraternising with the enemy or something. It was an us and them kind of thing.
And this is obviously, as we've said a few times, in 2015. Now, there was a meeting held with the IMB in November 2017, just after Panorama and the relevant period, which I know you didn't attend, and so we'll be able to ask James Wilson a bit more about that tomorrow. But you do address in your statement the fact that during that meeting, someone from the IMB described much of Panorama as being fluff and suggested that Panorama was just showing extreme moments, unrepresentative of day-to-day experiences of detained people. What's your reflection on that, on those comments?
I just found it unbelievably shocking.
Why?
Because the level of depravity in the footage was extraordinary, and I would have expected the IMB to be deeply shocked and reflective about it having happened on their watch.
And was you've said in your statement that you think that this is all a reflection of the IMB's tendency to accept uncritically what went on, to overlook or fail to empathise with detained persons, and to over-empathise with Brookhouse management. Can you give any insight as to why you think that happened, that there was an under-empathy with detained people and an over-empathy with Brookhouse management?
No, I mean, I don't know whether over time people become inured to the suffering that they see when it happens repeatedly, but other people who understand more about how cultures develop in institutions, I think, would be able to explain that rather than me.
And you talk about this tendency to accept uncritically and failing to empathise with detained people, over-empathising with Brookhouse management. Do you think that position remains the case today, or is there an improvement?
I don't think I see enough of their day-to-day work to be able to comment on that.
Thank you. Just wanted to ask you a few more questions about the current position of Brookhouse now. You understand that the inquiry is looking at the relevant period in 2017, but needs to understand a bit about the current situation so that the chair can be assisted with making recommendations in due course. I asked you before about whether, on reflection, you felt that there was anything that you could have done as an organisation to understand more about the severity of the mistreatment that was shown in Panorama. And you said that with the access that you've been given, you didn't think there was anything. Have there been any changes made to your own policies and procedures since Panorama was broadcast in order to try and get a better understanding?
I mean, so many changes.
I suppose any
in
changes
our
that
work
were
since 2017.
I suppose any changes that you can think of that, to your knowledge, were done specifically to try and get a handle on the stuff that was shown in Panorama.
That's quite difficult to answer that, sorry.
Okay. In terms of drop-in sessions today or now, are these occurring in person again post-COVID, or are they?
They
still,
are,
they
yes.
And do they continue to be held in the legal visits corridor at the moment?
They do, yes.
And are detainees still required to go through a security search and barred gate to reach you?
They are, yes.
But you said that you've suggested to Serco that they could potentially take place in the library, and they're considering that at the moment. Is that
Yes.
right? And one of the things you say in your statement at paragraph 214 for the transcriber is that you continue to be told that control and restraint is used too frequently and that too often disproportionate force is used, causing injuries. I'm asked to ask you a Rule 10 on behalf of Bat Murphy, which is how do you think the number of reports of disproportionate force now compares to the relevant period? Can you compare them?
It's very, very difficult to compare numbers because number in the centre is so much lower now.
I suppose the proportion of people you
Yeah.
speak to that are complaining about that type of thing, are you able to help us in that sense?
I think if you were to look at the numbers of people going to segregation, you would gain a sense of the numbers of people who feel they've experienced disproportionate force.
Okay. You think those two go essentially hand in hand?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we've talked obviously about the complaints processes. Do you think that there continues to be a culture of detained people feeling it's pointless to raise complaints, or that doing so could put them at risk of jeopardising their immigration case?
Yes, I think people are very fearful of complaining.
And one of the things that you refer to in your statement when we're looking at the current situation is you say, first of all, at paragraph 52, that there was a group of detained people in 2020, 2021 who were highly vulnerable. And then you come on at paragraph 221 to quote from the IMB's annual report, which I think was published in May 2021.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to read to you what you quote. So that report said, the combination of the compressed nature of the charter flight programme, with Brookhouse as its sole basis for Dublin Convention flights, and the fundamental changes in the centre's population and nationalities, their different vulnerabilities and their needs, put the centre's systems, detainees and staff under great stress and raised some serious concerns for the board. Most notably, there was a dramatic increase in levels of self-harm and suicidal ideation, deficiencies in the induction process, and increased needs for legal support and Rule 35 assessments. And then you continue, this is what the IMB were saying, the board's view is that due to circumstances related to the Dublin Convention Charter Programme, in the latter months of 2020, Brookhouse was not a safe place for vulnerable detainees who crossed the channel in small boats. And they said this is evidenced by the high levels of self-harm and suicidal ideation in that time. And you then quote them saying, the board's view is that circumstances in Brookhouse related to the Dublin Convention Charter Programme amounted to inhumane treatment of the whole detainee population by the Home Office in the latter months of 2020. And they also note serious delays in access to Rule 35 assessments during August to December. So casting your mind back to the latter half of 2020 last year, does that accord with your experience at Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group?
Yes, we'd agree with the IMB.
Do you have anything to add or any more comment to make about what they say?
At that time, the people who had come across on small boats and been housed in the community were brought to detention without knowing that would be a possibility, and were in great distress. Most of them didn't speak English. A good proportion of them were victims of trafficking, but were never assessed as such. And because there were large numbers of people going through the centre, the delays for them getting legal advice were considerable. So it was an extraordinarily difficult time.
And I must ask you on behalf of Bat Murphy, we've spoken about how during the relevant period you were worried at GDWG about making complaints because of a fear about antagonising Brookhouse management or the Home Office. Looking at the position now, if you yourself or your organisation witnessed or overheard ill treatment, would you feel able to intervene or complain?
I would, yes.
And you're obviously the director now and the safeguarding lead. Is that the message which is you've given to your staff as well?
It is, yes.
And so, to give a very, I suppose, a stark example, the example you gave about seeing the same person on the floor and wanting to sort of kneel down and help them after they'd been refused bail, is that something that you think now you would feel able to intervene in?
That was a general manifestation of how people were unskilled in being able to relate to a vulnerable person. If I had a relationship where I was meeting the head of the centre and I could talk through my impressions, then that's definitely something I would share. I don't think it would be severe enough for a formal complaint.
Do you think that physically you would have been able to, you said that you sort of wanted to kneel down next to them, do you think you would be able to do that now?
I think I would have more confidence to do that, yes.
Chair, that's all the questions I have for this witness from Ms. Wings. Thank you. Do you have any questions, Chair?
Thank you. Just a few. So the first one I'll ask is just in relation to that last point, really. So in your role as safeguarding lead now, do you ever get invited to the safer custody management or safer community management meetings with G4S?
No,
Do you know if anybody else from your organisation does?
no one does.
And that has not happened historically either. Did it happen in the relevant period from your memory?
That's never happened.
Okay. Can I ask, do you have an opinion on whether that would be helpful?
Any opportunity to engage constructively with the centre would be helpful, yeah.
Okay, thank you, that's really helpful. So my other questions that relate to some of the evidence you gave a little earlier, so my apologies, they might be slightly out of context. You mentioned the need for us to be mindful of the fact that often when detained people are complaining, they may be moved elsewhere around the immigration detention estates, and so it can be difficult to kind of maybe track what happens to that complaint. Did you have any sense that there was anything deliberate about that? Do you think there was a connection between people complaining and them being moved, or was it just that was the way the system worked?
I don't know if it was allied to complaints, but sometimes if people encountered situations where they became difficult for the centre to manage, they would be moved on their way. And of course, those were exactly the type of events where there'd be interactions that could create a complaint to arise.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question, you mentioned also a little earlier in your evidence about the fact that staff names would be seen on a lanyard on there that they would often kind of wear around their neck, perhaps?
Yes.
Would you yourself know how to, would you be able to identify a member of staff by name that you would see frequently? Would you have been able to see the name on the lanyard, for example?
No. In fact, there were some staff that I might have known for many years and you know, be embarrassed to ask them their name because feeling I ought to know them, having seen them so many times. I'd have no way of establishing their name.
Okay. And is there any sense, did you get any sense that that was in any way deliberate, that people were not displaying their name, or was it just simply a fact that it's on a lanyard and sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't?
I think with me on the visits corridor, it was probably accidental, but my impression is that in the centre, if someone was doing something and they wanted to be unaccountable, that would be a way of enabling that to happen.
Did you ever have any complaints in respect of that, or is that just your impression?
No, people would say, I wanted to raise a complaint. I asked another officer what the officer's name was and he wouldn't tell me.
I believe you mentioned that in some of your evidence. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. They're all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms Pincus. Chair, if you're agreeable to it, I think the idea now would be to have a 15-minute break and then return for some reading in of detained person evidence. I think that reading in should take about 45 minutes, or so, half an hour to 45 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. So we will return at 5 to 3. If I can just thank you for your evidence. You've been with us for a long day, and I know it's not an easy experience, but I'm very grateful, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I will see the rest of you in 15 minutes. Thank you. Ms Moore, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We'll be moving to some read-in evidence on behalf of detained persons, and the first account is on behalf of D87.
Thank you.
D87 was detained in Brookhouse between 22nd of March and 14th of July 2017. He is a Nigerian national and was 41 years old during the relevant period. The inquiry attempted to contact him in October 2020, but has not managed to make contact with him. He has never provided a witness statement to the inquiry, or as far as we have seen in any other context, but we do have his account of certain events which happened during his detention, because he spoke to the Professional Standards Unit, the PSU, about them, and he's also featured on some footage. A brief record on the 12th of April 2017 shows that D87 was stopped by a member of staff, whose name is not on their note. Chair, this is at CJS 004739, page 2.
Thank you.
When asked what he was doing, he said he was collecting the signatures of detained people with families and children in the UK to raise human rights issues to the Home Office, and D87 himself has a partner and a young family in the UK. The staff member's note, which I've given you the reference for, says, I explained that he should be fighting his own cause and not everyone else's, and D87 said that he wanted to have a meeting with Home Office to tell them about people being detained. I explained that he could be deemed as inciting others. D87 said that wasn't his agenda and he doesn't want to cause trouble, he just wanted to make a statement. Again, I offered him words of advice about, and then in quotation marks, stirring up emotions, end quotation, and he said that he speaks the truth but peacefully. Chair, D87's records show that on the 21st of April 2017, he was due to be transferred to the Verne, an immigration detention centre in Dorset. However, he refused to go to reception, saying that the Verne was too far away from his family. He was not transferred. On the 31st of May 2017, he was moved to a single occupancy room. Documents relating to those events are at CJS 003531, pages 4 and 6. On the 9th of May 2017, D87 was again meant to be transferred to the Verne. Some of the events of this day featuring D87 were filmed by Callum Tully, along with discussions about the events between staff. The transcripts, which are all within TRN 0000077 at pages 7 to 16, 19 to 30 and 35 to 39, include discussions about the planned transfer, D87 speaking to Brookhouse staff about not wanting to go to the Verne, including because his children were able to visit him at Brookhouse, and then being told he needs to be presented to Taskor so he can explain those reasons to them. He then went with the Brookhouse staff and was met by Taskor. D87 again said he did not want to go. He asked to see a member of healthcare staff, who took his blood pressure, which was normal. He said he had only been given 30 minutes notice to move and that he understood he was being moved due to bed space. Indeed, the earlier footage does record Shane Farrell telling D87, and I quote, Immigration, Home Office, whatever you want to call them, spoken to them okay, and they just told me that the reasons is they're trying to move out the single ox out of here to create more bed space, end quotes. D87 said that if he had to move, he would want to go to another London-based centre, and he said to a Taskor agent, if you was taking me to Harmondsworth or Colnbrook, I'd go with you. It's in London, that's even closer to my family, end quotes. He told the removal team that he had explained this to the Home Office. Eventually, after protracted discussions about his transfer, which he remained opposed to, the removal was abandoned. D87 returned to Ewing. Further footage shows him complaining to Mr. Pashali and Mr. Tully about the events of the day and about being returned to Ewing, rather than to a standard residential wing, which he had been told he could return to. When he is told that he's in E-wing but not in solitary confinement, he says, block is block. You're segregating me, that's what it means. During his time at Brookhouse, D87 made a number of complaints against the head of security, Michelle Brown, including allegations that she victimised him and was instrumental in his being wrongly placed in removal from association. That's Rule 40. On the 29th of June 2017, D87 made a written complaint, which we have at HOM 003105. He said that he had been speaking to the drug and alcohol support team about how it was important for staff to know the signs of spice users. He said that, unexpectedly, the woman he had spoken to told the head of security, Michelle Brown, that D87 had threatened to take a member of staff hostage, which he said he had not. He wrote that Michelle Brown had in the past segregated him for no reason, then authorised his removal from association, with no evidence of what was alleged to have been said. This had happened, he said, on the 27th of June, and then he said on the 28th, Michelle Brown again authorised a Rule 40 against him. He wrote that Michelle Brown was out to get him, although he did not know why. He made a further complaint about his removal from association and about Miss Brown on the 30th of June, which is at HOM 003106, adding that he challenged her to contact the police about the allegation and that she had nothing to say about that. Chair, the most significant events involving D87 occurred on the night of the 30th of June 2017. This is when D87 was relocated from E-Wing back to the CSU under Rule 40. There was a further event later that night when centre staff entered D87's room on the CSU. D87 made complaints about both of these events, which were investigated by the PSU, and the events of that night were also referred to Sussex Police. D87 has described his recollection of events to the PSU, and we have a very detailed note of his interview with the PSU, which is at HOM 002721. This interview was carried out by telephone, as D87 was at the time still within the CSU. Chair, the first event that night started about 5 p.m. What follows is from the account that he gave to the PSU. D87 described being released from CSU back to E-Wing, but still segregated. He asked DCM Dean Brackenridge about this situation, and when no sufficient answer was given, he said he would, in quotation marks, deal with G4S. He later told the PSU he meant this in a legal sense, not as a personal threat to staff. He says his door opened at about 5:20 p.m, and he was told he would be moved back to CSU due to making threats. Shortly after, he said a number of officers entered his room wearing protective equipment and with no warning, and without having a conversation about what was happening and why. D87 told the PSU he remained compliant. He said they struggled to hold him, but that he was using resistance and not aggression. In his own words, again as recorded by PSU, he says that then, in quotes, they floored me, they slammed me onto the floor, we all fell to the floor together. I was on my back. The two officers that were holding me, we all fell to the floor together, and another officer grabbed my head and pinned it onto the floor. D87 then told the PSU investigator that he walked to the CSU and sat down while they left the room. This event, he said, amounted to an assault. He told the PSU he did not believe they had simply misunderstood what he said as being a threat, rather that it was a conspiracy to use his words to punish him. He believed Michelle Brown was behind it, although she was not present. D87 said that as a result of this incident, he sustained a painful knee, bruises on his arms, and grazes on both elbows. He said that he did not at that point receive any medical attention. The second incident he spoke to the PSU about happened shortly after he had been put in the room in the CSU, so on the same night. And again, this is his account. D87 had covered the observation flap with tissue because people looking in were making him agitated. Officers then went round the back of the wing to look in through the window, as there were no curtains on the windows, which he saw as an invasion of privacy. He was also upset as he had not eaten. He began to get frustrated as he was being watched and started to ask for water and food and to say, "This is a human rights breach." He says no one explained why he could not have food and water, and hours passed. In D87's words, "I was so frustrated that I actually started thinking that I was going to hurt myself. So the sheet that was in the room, I took it, the bed sheet, and put it around my neck. Not in a way that I was tying my neck or anything, just for attention. I did it purely for attention so that the door could open and I could get food." He says this went on for 5 to 10 minutes. Then he made pretend choking noises and stopped talking, and some of the female staff on E-Wing were concerned. He said he then leant towards the wall with his head down silently for an hour or more. His flap was covered, but from the back of the room he could be observed through the window. He kept his eyes a little open and so could see people watching him but not helping, which he found chilling. They kept asking him to uncover the panel, but he remained silent, and they did not enter. He said the door finally opened after an hour or more, and 13 geared-up officers, in his words, entered, some with shields. He said he was attacked by them while on the floor. He said they cut the fabric, which was loosely around his neck, took his trainers, and took the bed sheets, mattresses, pillow, and clothes from the room. He He said they struck him with the shields and he could not react as he was not expecting it. They left the room within 3 to 4 minutes. He said he was now very upset and shouted until he lost his voice, including saying that he hoped the staff would die and likening them to the KKK. He says that he was not examined by a doctor or a nurse after the incident, although his face was injured and his whole body hurt. He said although he was still supposed to be on a 4-man unlock, in fact the staff on CSU that night were people he knew and who were worried about him, and opened his door, chatted to him and gave him cigarettes. He said 2 of the officers involved in the first incident attended his room and said they had only done so because they were told to, and told that they would be disciplined if they did not. He said he was seen by a doctor 5 days later. The inquiry has seen records which show that D87 remained on CSU under Rule 40 from the 30th of June to the 14th of July 2017, i.e. until he left Brookhouse, and these are at CJS 001419. The reason for the use of Rule 40 is recorded as maintaining the good order and security of the centre. On the 2nd of July 2017, D87 made a further complaint about Michelle Brown and his detention in CSU, which is at HOM 003107. He wrote that Michelle Brown was supposed to be in charge of security, and I quote, "And yet Brookhouse is drug-infested, i.e. spice. He accuses her of picking on people she did not like and of using, I quote, her power and authority to impose punishment on her victims," end quote. He said that she continues to make unfounded accusations against him. He says on the complaint form that he had asked Mrs. Brown if they'd met before, and, I quote, "She said that she met me once when I was collecting names of detainees who had British-born children, and she advised me not to do that because it might be deemed as an incitement. When I said, could that be the reason you might be picking on me, she said no," end quote. He said he asked her about her judgment and where she gets information, and eventually she stormed off and authorised another 24 hours segregation. On the 26th of July 2017, then Deputy Director of the Gatwick IRCs and Head of Brookhouse, Steve Skitt, wrote to D87 to tell him that the complaints about Michelle Brown had been investigated and not upheld. In summary, the response was that the decisions to place D87 on Rule 40 were due to his own behaviour, including that he'd made threats to staff. Mr. Skitt's letter is at HOM 002361 and summarises both the complaints and the response. There was also an investigation into D87's complaints regarding the 30th of June by the PSU, and a report was produced. D87 was interviewed, as I've mentioned, by phone on the 11th of July 2017. The PSU also considered footage and staff accounts, which have also been provided to the inquiry. By letter dated 21st of September 2017, D87 was informed of the PSU's findings. He had left Brookhouse by that point. The letter he received is at HOM 002364. The PSU's detailed report is at HOM 003153. And then there is a brief closure report at HOM 002363. The PSU found his complaints were both unsubstantiated. Chair, the accounts of others interviewed by PSU and the investigations carried out by G4S and the PSU in relation to those events will be considered during Phase 2. Thank you. Next, there's reading in evidence in relation to the detained person we have been calling D2054. D2054 is a Nigerian man who was detained at Brookhouse for just under 2 weeks, from the 15th to the 28th of June 2017. He has not provided a statement to the inquiry, and the inquiry has not been in contact with him, but we have his own account of certain events because he made complaints to the PSU, and we have documents relating to his time at Brookhouse. D2054 arrived in the UK around March 2005 on a visit visa. In 2016, he was arrested as an overstayer. He submitted a claim under Article 8 and later a leave to remain application based on his long residence in the UK and his family and private life, but both were refused. He was detained at Tinsley House in 2016. However, on the 4th of June 2016, a Rule 35.3 assessment by the doctor there at Tinsley House concluded that his significant scarring was consistent with his claim to have been tortured. The Home Office accepted that the Rule 35 report constituted independent evidence of torture, and he was released from detention. He claimed asylum around this time, which was refused on the 23rd of November 2016. Chair, documents relating to those events and to his ongoing detention are HOM 022941 and HOM 015482.
Thank you.
On the 15th of June 2017, while reporting as he was required to do due to his immigration status, he was detained and transferred to Brookhouse. On the 19th of June, he submitted further representations in support of an application for asylum. On the 21st of June, removal directions were set. That is, a place was booked for him on a charter flight to Lagos in Nigeria for the 28th of June. His detention review from the 21st of June notes that he had been considered under the Adults at Risk policy and assessed as risk level 2. He had no criminal history and was considered low risk, so escorts were not planned for his removal. An Assessment Care in Detention and Teamwork, ACDT document, was opened on the 21st of June, which is at HOM 002388, which says that D2054 had stated that he wants to die, I'm quoting from the ACDT now, stated that he wanted to die after being given removal directions. When asked, said he would not harm himself or try to take his own life. Low mood and crying uncontrollably, end quote. Within those ACDT notes, a member of staff, Miss Murray, has recorded that D2054, I quote, told me that he was tortured in Nigeria and cannot return back to his home country, end quotes. He said the food at Brookhouse upset his stomach, so he had not been taking the servery food. She suggested he make an appointment with the mental health nurse, as well as speak to the solicitor when they visited. He was seen by Dr. Uzarali on the 27th of June, who noted food refusal, PREV, P-R-E-V, for 5 days. He was seen later that day by the mental health nurse in his room, and she recorded that he was feeling a bit stressed. A mental health appointment was booked for the 29th of June. It's not clear whether the nurse knew about the removal directions in place. D2054 complained to the PSU about events on the 28th of June 2017, and we have his account of what he says happened. D2054's account of the day can be found in an email he sent to the PSU after his removal, and the PSU's records of further correspondence with him, and we have these at CJS 001627. He said while in Brookhouse he was starved for 5 days without food, as he would only boil potatoes, and the other food made him ill, and he wasn't always provided with food he could eat. He told the PSU that healthcare said he had lost 3 kilograms in 5 days. He recalls that on the 28th of June, he was given food separately to others. He said it was boiled potatoes that looked like they'd been boiled in a chemical, but he didn't have any choice but to eat. He told the PSU the food made him feel lazy and uncomfortable, and he felt it had been poisoned, not to kill him, but to make him removable to Nigeria. He goes on, and I quote, 1 hour later, they came and told me that I will be flying to Nigeria in a few hours. I don't even know what happened to me. I got angry and started using shaving stick blade, stabbed myself 3 times on my arms, which I don't know why I did that, end quote. He says his roommate fetched help. D2054's medical notes that day show that one of the nurses who attended saw him bleeding, clearly upset, and at times hyperventilating. His medical records show that one of his wounds required steri strips and dressing. He was moved to Ewing for constant observations. He also told the PSU that when he was told about removal, he asked to see his solicitor, and his sister visited him that day. His complaint goes on to say that a few hours later, he was brought food and asked for his medication, but they didn't know about it. He said he'd not been seen by healthcare and had requested paracetamol for a headache, but hadn't been given any. He wrote, and I quote, "Then around 9 p.m, one of the security came in and informed the one on my door that they are moving me to Nigeria in a few hours. Then I started crying because I'm still bleeding a bit and lost some blood already. Then around 11 p.m, I saw a lot of security men, some with video cameras recording what was going on. And they came to me that they are moving me to the airport. I was trying to explain to them my condition. They rushed me and I hit my head on the floor and I became unconscious. Then I started shouting, 'Jesus.' He told the PSU during the later telephone interview that he had been semi-conscious and 6 officers had been on top of him holding his legs and arms. One had handcuffed him, causing him a lot of pain, and he said one of the officers was covered in blood from D2054's self-harm wounds. He said they then handcuffed him to one of the officers and that he was still bleeding and had been dressed in a long-sleeved T-shirt to hide the bleeding. He said he was put in the van and that he told them he had lost his memory and was promised that there would be healthcare at the airport, but there was not. and he was put on a plane to Nigeria with only one of the 6 medications he required and with no healthcare assistance. His email says he was at risk of bleeding while on board, and he says, "I've been asking myself, where is the human right? Instead, people are being treated like this. Please, I would like police to investigate on this matter. It's very bad. There is CCTV around the premises." Due to the nature and allegations of excessive force and food tampering, the complaint was referred to Sussex Police on the 20th of July 2017. On the 11th of August, the PSU conducted a telephone interview with D2054, who was in Nigeria at the time. He also provided photographs of his injuries. He suggested his former roommate could provide his own account, but he had already left Brookhouse with no forwarding address. The PSU considered his photographs, D2054's account, the paperwork, accounts of Brookhouse staff, and video footage. On the 15th of September 2017, D2054 was informed by the PSU that all of his complaints had been found to be unsubstantiated. The PSU's findings were passed on to Sussex Police, who considered that report and filed the incident with no further criminal investigation required. This is at SXP 000018. Other materials and accounts considered by the PSU in reaching this conclusion will be considered during Phase 2.
Thank you.
Chair, thank you.
Ms. Livingston.
Just going to grab my water 1 second. Thank you. Chair, I'm now going to read in evidence in relation to D2953. He's another individual who has not given his account of his experiences to the inquiry directly, but following his detention and after making complaints about his treatment, he was interviewed by Rukhsana Rafiq of the Professional Standards Unit, the PSU, on the 18th of October 2017. That's at HOM 004880. And 2953 was also interviewed by Stephen Cotter of G4S on the 6th of November 2017, and that's at CGS 00073658.
Thank you.
Both interviews were conducted via an interpreter. Chair, in summary, on the 15th of February 2018, the Professional Standards Unit concluded, and their report is at CGS 001506, pages 20 to 37, that A, on the 10th of June 2017, DCM Murphy hit him hard on the left thigh, leaving a bruise. On the 11th of June 2017, DCM Murphy punched him on the chest/lower abdomen. And on the 16th of June 2017, DCM Murphy punched him on the left side of his head. Chair, various staff members were interviewed in relation to these allegations. This evidence, along with other evidence relating to the investigations into the complaints, will be addressed in Phase 2, but for now I'm going to concentrate on the account given by D2953. In his interview with the PSU, D2953 started by saying that he wanted compensation and that the first time, 10th June, he was punched on the left thigh. The second time was 11 June, in the same part of the centre, when he was punched on the abdomen and near to the chest area. The third time was 16 June, when he was punched on the left side of the head and face near his left ear. Chair, firstly, in relation to the first incident on the 10th of June. D2953 said in his interview with the PSU, and I quote, "He was transferred during the night to Brookhouse Immigration Removal Centre, IRC, by British Transport Police. Between 3 and 3:30 hours, they left the police station and arrived at Brookhouse IRC after 5 p.m. He was feeling a bit stressed. The centre had an appearance of a prison, with big steel gates and guards. He has not been in any establishment/prison before." D2953 said he was locked up in a room and started kicking a plastic bucket because he was feeling stressed. He said he wanted to go for a walk, but was told by a female guard it was not possible. He then describes how he was transferred to what he described as, and I quote, "the awful wing," saying that Officer Derrick, as he called him at the time, searched him before putting him in the room. He said that he did not resist on transfer, saying, and I quote, "I have had 2 operations in my chest as well as a hernia operation. There is no way I would get physical and resist." Contemporaneous records show that D2953 was placed in E-Wing, with an entry recording this made by Derek Murphy in the evening of 9th of June 2017. D2953 describes being on this wing as making him even more stressed because, and I quote, "There was nothing there. No TV, his phone was removed, there were no sockets to charge anything, he did not think there was even a toilet. There was no bedding, only a blanket and pillow." D2953 then gave a description of Officer Derek, which both the PSU and G4S later concluded referred to Derek Murphy. D2953 said that there was someone else present when Derek punched him on his left thigh, describing how, and I quote, "There was a young lad at the door. Only Derek entered the room and hit me hard on the left thigh." When asked why he was hit, D2953 said, and I quote, "Because I was banging the door and shouting. That doesn't give him the right. I was even more stressed having been transferred to that wing in those facilities. There was no TV." He said that he didn't remember if Derek said anything and said, I quote, "The important thing is he hit me," end quote, and that he had hit him once with his right hand. D2953 said that he got a bruise from the punch, but said, and I quote, "I did not receive any medical help. There was nobody else there. There was hardly any guards or staff on that wing." He also said that the young officer at the door, and I quote, "must have seen it because the door was open." D2953 said that, and I quote, "The way I was treated was just barbaric," end quote. In response to a question about whether he went to healthcare to ask them to take a picture of the bruise or anything, he said, and I quote, "How can I ask for anything? After hitting me, he locked the door and left with the young lad. There was nobody else in sight to ask and seek help," end quote. When asked whether he'd told anyone else, he said, "How could I tell anybody else? I was locked up in my room and could not even go near the window. There was nobody to talk to." During his interview with Stephen Cotter on the 6th of November, the interview summary records a similar account in which D2953 said he was hit by Derek with his right fist to his left leg. Carry on.
Please continue, thank you.
And pointed to his outer thigh as the spot. He said that he was hit by Derek because, and I quote, "I was hitting the door, shouting and kicking at it." He said that a boy, brackets young guard, saw it. In relation to the second incident, this is on the 11th of June, D2953 said in his interview with the PSU that Derek punched him on the left side of his chest and the lower abdomen near the ribs. When asked why this happened, D2953 said, "Because I was banging on the door and windows. Why else would he do it? You can ask him why he did it. I haven't hit him, he hit me. You should ask him." D2953 said he was banging on the door and window because he was fed up with being in that room behind the steel door. When asked how many times Derek hit him, he said, and I quote, "He hit me once. If he hit me any more times, I don't think I would have made it. Would have been alive." He says that he was sitting on his bed and Derek opened the door, entered and punched him. D2953 said about Derek Murphy, and I quote, "He said something, but it can't have been important. I can't remember what he said. The important thing is, he hit me. He was telling me off because I was speaking against the police, saying they were all corrupt because of some incident which happened in May." He added that, and I quote, "It wasn't as strong a hit as it was on my left. It wasn't as strong a hit as it was on my left thigh, but it was still very painful because I've had 2 operations on my chest." He thought that it happened in the afternoon and that there was somebody else at the door who didn't come into the room. He also noted, and I quote, "I was locked up in that room. I was banging on the door and windows. Nobody offered me any medication, any antidepressants. I hardly got any sleep while I was in there, 1 or 2 hours a day." In his interview with Stephen Cotter of G4S on the 6th of November, D2953 gave a similar account, saying that Derek came in and hit him because he was, and I quote, "shouting, pushing, kicking," and was stressed. He demonstrated to Mr. Cotter that he was punched to the kidney area on his left side and said there was another officer with Derek. In relation to the third incident on 16th of June, D2953 said that this happened on a different part of the wing and was just before lunch. He said that he was punched on the head and ear, and that this happened because, I quote, "I told him I had human rights. He wanted to transfer me to another wing with 2 others. I told him I was a citizen and had human rights. I can't sleep when there's 1 person around, never mind 2. He wanted his own room." In response to this, D2953 says that Derek, and I quote, "told me to follow him to the staff room. When we got in, he closed the door and hit me on the left side of the head. There was another man there who was roughly about my age, who was wearing a white shirt and red tie." He noted, and I quote, "The other person in the room was a manager. He was a witness, and I am guessing that because of the witness, he later came to apologise for what he did and shook my hand." D2953 suggested that it might have been because of having a witness there that Derek later came and apologised and shook his hand, given that he'd never had any apology from him the first or second time. He says that following the punch, I quote, "I was aching for a few days," end quote, and that it must have been Derek's right hand which he used. D2953 recalled that Derek hit me between the jaw and the ear, where the glasses frame would normally sit. Again, he said, and I quote, "I was not offered any medical help. I went back to my room to watch TV and was not offered any medical help." D2953 was asked by Stephen Cotter of G4S about whether he had been punched or bitten, in light of the other records, which did record the word bitten. D2953 said punched and demonstrated being punched on his leg, side and face. When asked whether a manager came to speak to him about these incidents later in June, and asked whether he wanted to inform the police, he said that he didn't remember this happening, but it was possible. When asked about other officers, he said to the PSU, and I quote, "They were not all as bad as Derek. There were some other guards, they seemed quite nice, and they have never lifted a hand. They were just like prison guards." Chair Derek Murphy was interviewed by the PSU and denied the allegations against him. However, as already mentioned, the PSU concluded that the 3 allegations of assault were substantiated. You'll hear more about Derek Murphy's account and the PSU investigation in Phase 2. Chair, I'll briefly summarise the evidence relating to the complaints and other contemporaneous evidence that was documented. As mentioned, the 3 incidents which I've discussed happened on the 10th of June, the 11th of June and the 16th of June. In total, D2953 rang the Equalities Advisory Support Service helpline on 40 occasions between 10th of June and 17th of July 2017. These calls included general complaints about his human rights, that he was having to share a room, and that he was treated badly. Of particular note, Chair, on the 16th of June 2017, so that's the day of the 3rd incident, D2953 said in his final of 7 calls to the helpline that day, and this was the only call in which he had access to an interpreter, I quote, "Guard hit me 3 times. The man was aggressive to me and apologised afterwards. After 3rd time he hit me, he sat on the bed next to me and was explaining something. The operator asked if they should call Brookhouse, to which D2953 said, and I quote, "I don't want to make things worse, but you can." The operator did not phone Brookhouse. On the 20th of June, it's recorded that D2953 entered the library at Brookhouse and asked to speak to the manager, saying he had been bitten, as it's recorded, by a staff member 3 times and wanted compensation. We also have a complaint document dated the 23rd of June 2017, so that's 7 days after the 3rd incident, which is not referred to by either the PSU's investigation or the G4S investigation conducted by Stephen Cotter, and which says, and I quote, "I was beaten from an old, almost 60 years old, and high, almost 2 metres, 3 times. The name to this old man, from security staff to Brookhouse, is Eric maybe." D2953 then goes on in this complaint document to describe the 3 times. And I quote, "In left leg on 10 June, in a locked with steel door room on ground floor, Eden Wing, I was have a blue areas to my left leg, in left side to my chest, on the 11th of June, and in left side to my head, nearby to the left ear. Every shot to the head is very dangerous, sometimes and for the life, on 16th June 2017, in the staff room on Eden Wing. He says, and I quote, "Was another security staff near in this staff room, this man was whacking this shot to my head." At the end, it says, "I want very big compensation." The document also complains that he was not given his medicines for 9 days, including antidepressants which helped him with terrible insomnia. That part of his complaint, Chair, in relation to the medicines, did receive a response on the 5th of July 2017, saying that they apologised for him not receiving some of his medication for 7 days, but they had to request his medical records from his GP, and that's at CGS 001616. On 29th of June 2017, so that's 13 days after the third incident, D2953 said in one of 11 calls he made that day to the Equalities Advisory Support Service helpline that he had been bit or hit 3 times. No interpreter was on this call. On the same day, 29th June, there was a recorded use of force against D2953. In his incident report, DCM Philip Page records that D2953, and I quote, "kept repeating that he had been assaulted and he wanted compensation. He said the assault had happened on 16th June. And that's at CGS 0073644. In the report of injuries to detainee by Nurse Donna Batchelor, that day on the 29th of June, it was noted, and I quote, "No new red marks, bruising, lacerations were noted. He does have multiple scarring from surgeries. Query," and that's the question mark beforehand, "injuries prior to today." Miss Batchelor also recorded in D2953's records on that day, in his medical records, and I quote, "States has been punched and hit by officers. States hit around side of head, no bruising or red marks noted." And Chair, that's at HOM 032247_9. On the 3rd of July 2017, it was noted again in his records, "Detainee has been disruptive since his arrival. He claims he was bitten by staff 3 times." Chair, as you heard briefly during the opening to this inquiry, and as you hear more about in Phase 2, several of these complaints were not passed on, and none of the complaints regarding assaults were investigated at the time. It was not until at least September 2017, 3 months later and after Panorama had been broadcast, that D2953's complaints about being punched 3 times by a member of staff began to be investigated by both G4S and the PSU. Chair, that concludes the evidence for D2953. And then finally, for today, I'm going to read in evidence relating to D1747. On 20th of June 2017, D1747 made a complaint about an incident that had occurred that same day. That complaint is at HOM 002520 and is recorded as having been received on the 22nd of June 2017. The complaint read, and I quote, "On 20 June 2017, at 8:20, in the room where the medicines are being dispensed, got attacked by one of the officers. At first he started abusing me verbally in an obscene manner. When I pointed it out, he hit me twice with his fists in my chest. While still abusing me verbally, he threw my ID card under my legs. When later on my wing, I asked my manager, Haley, for the surname of this officer. She did not give it to me." D1747 said, and I quote, "During this incident, there were a couple of other officers in the room and a few prisoners from the above-mentioned detention facility. There were also 2 monitoring cameras. I reported this incident to the police too." He then identified 3 witnesses, who the inquiry knows as D1771, D1686, and an officer called Christian Brown. As part of a PSU investigation into his complaint, D1747 was interviewed on the 26th of July. A summary of that interview is at HOM 002521. D1747 said he was in healthcare to get his medication, and having taken it, he put his cup in the rubbish bin and moved away from the hatch to make space for the next person. When asked, D1747 said it was, and I quote, a lie that he had had his medication in his left hand and only pretended to take it, end quote, saying that he needed his medication, so why wouldn't he have taken it? He also said that he did not hide his medicine. D1747 said that DCO Murphy may have thought that he hadn't taken the pills, but he did and put the empty pill container and water cup in the rubbish bin. According to D1747, an officer, who we know to have been DCO Murphy, then came up to him and said, "What you doing, fucking idiot?" D1747 later said that DCO Murphy also said other, and I quote, very bad things, and that he was very shocked that officers who worked in the detention centre could say such things. When asked during his interview, D1747 said that Derek Murphy did not ask him, and I quote, not to be silly, end quote, but said, and I quote, "What you doing, fucking idiot," end quote. D1747 said that maybe DCO Murphy and he were quite close together, maybe too close, but he didn't know. When asked to comment on the statement from another detainee, D71, that he went close to DCO Murphy, he didn't agree. He said, and I quote, "Next time I promise I smash this guy. Who touch me, I smash as well. But me, I have to go to prison." He recalled that maybe another DCO held DCO Murphy, but he wasn't sure. D1747 said that he held his hands behind his back and said, I quote, "Excuse me, what you say," end quote. According to D1747, Derek Murphy then hit him in the chest with his fists, with both hands, to which he responded by saying, "What you doing?" He recalled, and I quote, "The DCO hit him very hard, enough to make him take a few steps back, but could not remember if the DCO pulled his hands back to hit him or if it was with hand or fist," end quote. D1747 says that Derek Murphy then tried to hit him again, but 1747 pushed his hands down and another detainee came between them. A second officer, DCO Brown, then took D1747 out of the room and told him to relax, and Derek Murphy then came and threw D1747's ID card at his feet, saying something like, and this is according to D1747, I quote, "You fucking idiot wanker." D1747 said he was not shouting but was nervous as it was a stressful situation. D1747 says that he later called the police to report this incident. He also said that he asked a female DCO wing manager for the name of the DCO who had hit him. She said she didn't know, but came back an hour later saying she had his name. 1747 said he did not believe it possible that the wing manager didn't remember DCO Murphy's name and thought it was because she wanted to speak to DCO Murphy first. When he was told the name, at this point, D1747 says that he said he didn't need it now, as he was going to complain and he had her name for the complaint. He did not recall if he was angry and shouting when he got back to the wing. He said that maybe he was speaking loudly and fast because he was nervous, and accepted it was, and I quote, "possible that the wing manager could have mistaken this with him appearing to be angry." D1747 didn't complain to the wing manager at first because he didn't think there was any point. Later, another detainee told D1747 about the locked yellow box, and that complaints go straight to the Home Office, not detention centre staff. D1747 is recorded as confirming that, and I quote, "he had no injuries, was not hurt, did not go to healthcare, and the incident would not be mentioned on his health record." D1747 also recounts that when he saw DCO Murphy later, DCO Murphy laughed in his face. Additionally, the day after the incident, D1747 says that he saw DCO Murphy give a pack of tobacco to the detainee that came between them. He says that after a month the police came and talked to him, but despite D1747 calling them several times since, they have said nothing. And this is what he said during his interview with the PSU, which was on the 26th of July 2017. In that interview, D1747 said that he didn't want DCO Murphy to go to prison, but felt that the detention centre wasn't the right place for him to work. D1747 said that he wanted to continue with his complaint because, and I quote, he does not want other detainees to suffer. When asked, D1747 said he didn't know why his version of events differed from the staff witnesses, but thought it, I quote, a simple answer that they were all working together and were taking care of each other. In relation to the two detained persons identified by D1747 as witnesses, firstly, D1686 was approached by two staff members to give an incident on 5th of July. D1686 said he remembered the incident but declined to give a statement. He said that if it went to court, he would testify or talk to the police, but would not give a statement now. And that's recorded at HOM 003493. The second individual, D1771, was noted to have been removed, and therefore no statement could be obtained from him. Additionally, and as I've already referred to, on the 6th of July a statement was provided on behalf of D71, who was identified by a staff member as opposed to D1747 as having been present. That statement, at HOM 002419, records that D71 witnessed an officer push D1747 as he encroached into his personal space. The statement says, and I quote, I don't believe the officer did anything wrong as the detainee got in his face unnecessarily. And at the bottom of the statement it says, DCM D. Brackenridge has written this information for me at my request and is a true version of events. The statement is signed by D71 and witnessed by DCM Brackenridge and another member of staff. It is not explained in the PSU's report why the PSU investigator, Nick Adamson, asked for these statements to be obtained by G4S staff rather than doing so himself. When D1747 was asked why D71's statement agreed with that of staff, he said that he thought maybe the detainee had problems as well, but couldn't say what was going on in other people's heads. We have a record of a Sussex police log at SXP 000055, which records D1747 having phoned the police on the day of the incident and saying he was beaten up by an officer and sworn at. It records that he was beaten in his chest, fell on the ground, and the officer kept beating him. The officer is recorded as being Derek. The police log records that D1747 was speaking Polish and that a colleague interpreted and got the details. The following day, the 21st of June, there is a record of another phone call to the police, during which D1747 says that he wants the police to come that day, saying that he thinks there were camera filming, he is worried it will be his word against the offender, that the officer keeps walking around and smiling at him, that the officer weighs 100 kilograms and he only weighs 60 kilograms, and that the officer was hitting him very hard and could have killed him. There is a further entry on 25th of June 2017 where an officer spoke with DCM Nick London, security manager on the day, who told the police that 1747 tried to conceal meds, then became aggressive towards the officer, and the officer used reasonable force and an open hand palm push to move him away. It appears, Chair, that based on this, the matter was recorded by the police as no crime, and it was noted that it would not be investigated. However, there is a subsequent record that the police came to Brookhouse and viewed the CCTV footage on the 6th of July 2017, and that's at HOM 003492. Chair, as I've already intimated, the PSU investigation also included an interview with DCO Derek Murphy, who denied the allegation of assault, and witness statement from others. As mentioned previously, you'll hear more about their accounts and the PSU investigation in Phase 2. But for present purposes, in summary, It can be noted that in the report, which is at HOM 003522, it was noted that the police visited D1747 and viewed CCTV and decided not to take any further action, concluding that DCO Murphy was not at fault and was within his rights to openly push D1747 away, as he had entered DCO Murphy's space in an aggressive manner. The PSU investigation concluded, on the basis of statements from other members of staff, one other detained person, and the CCTV, that the allegation by D1747 against DCO Murphy was unsubstantiated, and that the use of force by DCO Murphy was justified. You will also hear, Chair, in Phase 2 evidence from John Collier, the use of force expert instructed by the inquiry in relation to this incident. Chair, the inquiry does have CCTV footage of this incident, which has been retained and provided to John Collier and can be played now. That's at disc 08, and it's from 2:40 minutes, please. And Chair, this is CCTV, so it will obviously be silent. I think it can be stopped now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, that concludes the reading in evidence in relation to D1747, and it concludes the evidence for today. I think with your permission, we'll sit again tomorrow morning at 9:30, if that's okay.
Indeed, thank you very much. I'll see you at 9:30 tomorrow.